On a freezing Montana night, a farmer opened his barn to a scarred wild Mustang. What began as shelter became a test of trust, law, and love. From storms that slammed doors to crowds that watched in awe, every step carried the risk of losing everything again. But when the open gate offered freedom, the choice the horse made left the entire town and his grieving family in tears. The wind screamed across the wide plains of Montana, carrying with it sheets of snow that erased fences, barns, and even the line of the hills beyond. Ethan Cole leaned his weight against the barn door, the wood rattling and booing under the pressure of the storm. The lantern swinging overhead cast a flickering glow, throwing long shadows across his weathered face. His breath rose in white puffs, disappearing almost instantly into the freezing dark. The farm had endured many winters, but not one like this. Tonight the storm felt personal, merciless, heavy, as if testing him again. His hands, roughened by years of work at the forge and in the wheat fields, trembled slightly as he forced the latch closed. He muttered to himself, more to the ghosts in his head than the wind, "Not tonight. I can't lose more tonight." Then it came. A shape in the storm. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the lantern light, snow bending into form, but the movement was too deliberate. Out of the white curtain stepped a horse. Its coat, dark gray streaked with ice, shimmered under the lantern's sway. Its mane whipped like smoke, eyes wide, nostrils flaring steam into the bitter cold. The animal staggered, its legs trembling, yet its stance remained defiant. It was no neighbor's gelding. This was a Mustang, wild and unbranded. Ethan's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed to drive it away. Wild horses were trouble, dangerous to handle, and the law didn't allow a man to claim one so easily. But then the horse lifted its head, and their eyes met. Something raw and familiar flickered in that gaze. Fear edged with pride, the kind Ethan knew well. The lantern caught a long scar running down its left shoulder, a pale mark against the storm-dark hide. Ethan's chest tightened. Behind him, the barn door rattled again, threatening to tear loose. He had to choose, keep the stranger out in the storm, or open the last bit of shelter he had. The memory of another storm rose unbidden, of the night his wife had not returned home. The guilt that gnawed at him still. He could almost hear her voice, gentle but insistent. "Don't turn away from what needs you, Ethan." The horse snorted, pawed at the snow, but did not flee. It stood there as though waiting, testing him. Ethan pressed his gloved hand against the latch, his jaw tightening. The wind howled, the barn shook, and Ethan swung the door open wide. Snow burst inside, swirling around the lantern light. The Mustang hesitated only a moment, then pushed forward, hooves clattering on the wooden floor. Ethan pulled the door shut. Against the gale, the thud echoing through the rafters. Inside the barn, silence fell but for the groan of timbers and the horse's heavy breathing. The Mustang circled once, nervous, head tossing, before settling in the corner near the hay. Ethan watched from a distance, the lantern light painting his figure in gold and shadow. For the first time in years, the barn felt alive with more than memory. Ethan drew in a slow breath, shaking snow from his coat. He had not planned this, had not wanted it, yet the storm had delivered something wild and wounded to his door. He whispered under his breath, almost as if to himself, "Guess we're both stuck here tonight." And in that fragile silence, with snow pressing at the walls and the lantern flame holding steady, the story of a man and a Mustang began. "Guess we're both stuck here tonight," Ethan had whispered into the barn's shadows. The words hung in the air, fragile as frost, as he set the lantern on a nail and rubbed warmth back into his fingers. The Mustang's breath still thundered in the rafters, the animal shifting, testing the strange new cage. Snow pressed against the boards outside, muting the world, making the silence between man and beast sound louder than any storm. Ethan leaned against a post, studying the horse as if it might vanish when he blinked. He recognized that look. The wild eyes, restless but tired, the way it held itself like a soldier refusing to fall. It mirrored the way he'd stood at the graveside 3 winters ago, stiff and silent, while the whole town offered words he never heard. His wife had gone out on a storm night, much like this, to fetch medicine for their daughter. The truck never made it back. That memory was stitched into him as tightly as the scar running down the Mustang's shoulder. Behind the closed kitchen window of the farmhouse, another silence pressed. A different one. Lila, his daughter, sat with her sketchbook, the pencil lines heavy and sharp. She had watched her father retreat into himself since her mother's death, watched the walls go up around him like snowdrifts. He worked the land, swung the hammer at the forge, but he rarely looked her in the eye anymore. Their conversations were short, transactional. Homework done, fence fixed, bills overdue. Everything unsaid hung in the room like unburned smoke. Tonight, though, she noticed the flickering lantern through the snow. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped out, crunching through drifts to the barn. The cold cut her cheeks pink, but curiosity pushed her on. When she eased the barn door open, her breath caught. A wild horse, gray as storm clouds, mane tangled, eyes fierce, stood only a few feet from her father. The animal's hooves stamped softly, the sound sharp in the hush. "Dad?" Her voice was small, more question than word. Ethan turned, startled, and for a moment looked as though he'd been caught in something shameful. His jaw clenched, then relaxed. "Storm brought us company," he said flatly, but his voice had a tremor. Lila's eyes widened, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook still clutched to her chest. She had drawn horses since she could hold a pencil, though her father never asked to see. Now one stood breathing before her, real and alive, its muscles shifting under a coat frosted with snow. She stepped closer, but Ethan raised a hand. "Careful," he warned. "He's wild, don't get too close." But the horse didn't shy at her presence. Its ears flicked, and for a long moment it simply watched her. Something in her stillness, the way she didn't try to reach, seemed to ease the tension in its stance. It lowered its head, not submission, but a concession, a fleeting gesture of trust. Ethan felt the knot in his chest tighten. He had spent years building walls, refusing to touch the grief that gnawed him, but now here was his daughter, silent and brave, standing before the creature as if she belonged in its world. He swallowed hard. The storm raged on outside, but inside the barn, another kind of storm gathered. Old wounds stirred. The night he failed to fix the broken fence before the blizzard, the guilt of not being there when his wife needed him, the distance that grew between him and the girl who bore her mother's eyes. The Mustang was not just a horse, it was a mirror, reflecting back everything Ethan had tried to bury. He turned away, tugging his coat tighter, pretending to busy himself with hay. "Get back inside, Lila. It's too cold." But Lila didn't move. She opened her sketchbook with trembling fingers, revealing pages of horses drawn in charcoal, each one with wild eyes and flowing manes. She held it up without speaking. The Mustang flicked its ears again, as if it understood. For a moment, Ethan almost spoke, almost told her that her drawings were good, almost confessed that he saw his wife's gentleness in every line. But the words stuck, trapped behind years of silence. Instead, he threw another handful of hay into the stall and muttered, "It's just for tonight. In the morning, he's gone." The words tasted bitter. He didn't believe them, and neither did Lila. She stepped back slowly, eyes never leaving the horse, then slipped out into the night, the door closing soft behind her. Ethan stayed behind, listening to the rhythm of the Mustang's breathing. His own heart echoed it, uneven but steady, as if the two had found a reluctant harmony. He leaned against the stall, the lantern glow falling across the scar on the horse's shoulder, and whispered again, though no one was left to hear. "We're both carrying ghosts, aren't we?" The Mustang snorted, the sound sharp and final, as if answering. And somewhere deep in Ethan's chest, the wall cracked just enough for the storm to slip in. Ethan's words lingered long after Lila had gone back inside, leaving the barn steeped in silence, save for the wind sighing against the wall. This Mustang shifted, hooves scraping on the wooden floor, ears flicking back and forth at every creak of the rafters. Ethan leaned on the post, his shoulders heavy, eyes caught between the scarred animal and the memory of his daughter holding up her sketchbook. He wanted to chase the images away, but they clung like burrs, his wife's voice, his daughter's unspoken questions, the weight of years he had carried without speaking. Morning broke, pale and cold. Snowdrifts curled high against the fences, and the world outside the farmhouse was muffled under white. Ethan pulled on his boots and stepped back into the barn. The lantern from the night before had gone out, replaced by faint daylight spilling through the slats. The Mustang stood where it had settled, sides heaving slow, steam curling from its nostrils. Its eyes tracked him immediately, sharp and untrusting. "Still here," Ethan muttered. He laid a bucket of water inside the stall, the liquid trembling in the cold air. The horse didn't move closer, but didn't shy either, only watched. Ethan tossed hay into the corner and backed away. There was something in the animal's posture, its head high, ears pricked, that reminded him of a man who refuses to bow even when exhausted. Later that morning, Lila crept in, sketchbook tucked under her arm. She paused at the door, the barn light catching on her hair. Ethan, hammering nails back into a loose board, glanced up with a frown. "Schoolwork done?" She didn't answer. Instead, she eased herself to the edge of the stall, sitting cross-legged in the hay, her pencil already in hand. The Mustang turned toward her, muscles taut, tail swishing once. Ethan almost stepped forward to pull her back, but something stopped him. Lila wasn't reaching out. She wasn't coaxing or calling. She simply looked, sketched, and breathed. Hours passed in quiet like that. Ethan worked in the corner, tools clinking, while Lila drew, and the Mustang watched her. The barn filled with a rhythm, hammer, pencil scratch, hoof stamp, breath. Ethan felt it in his bones, like an old song he hadn't heard in years. On the third day, Lila broke the silence. "He's not as wild as he looks," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the page. "He's wild enough," Ethan replied. "Don't forget what he is." But she smiled, just a small lift of her mouth, and flipped the sketch pad around. The picture showed the Mustang's head lowered, eyes less fierce, softer. Ethan looked at the drawing longer than he intended. Something about it unsettled him, not because it wasn't true, but because it might be. That evening, when Ethan carried in another bucket of water, he noticed the horse's breathing steady, its body less tense. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his hand, palm open. The Mustang's ears pinned back, and for a moment Ethan thought it would rear. But then it stood, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on him. The distance between them seemed endless, though it was only a few feet. He froze, hand hovering in the cold air. Every muscle in his arm trembled, not from fear of the horse, but from fear of what it meant to reach out. He had spent so long keeping everything at arm's length, his grief, his daughter, the memories of love lost. To reach for this animal was to risk more than a bite or a kick. It was to risk caring again. The horse leaned forward slightly, then stopped. Its muzzle hovered inches from his palm, warm breath brushing his skin. Time stretched thin, fragile. Then the horse turned away sharply, stamping its hoof, and retreated into the corner. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He pulled back his hand, flexing the fingers as if they had been burned. From the doorway, Lila's voice cut the silence. "He almost trusted you." She had been standing there, unnoticed, her sketchbook pressed against her chest. Ethan looked at her, words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her it wasn't trust, only caution. But he couldn't, because deep inside, he knew she was right. He wiped his palm on his coat and turned back to the stall. "We'll see," he said gruffly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thaw, faint and distant. Inside, man, daughter, and horse lingered in a fragile truce, each one waiting for the other to take the next step. The fragile truce inside the barn carried through the next days, stitched together by silence, breath, and the sound of sketching pencils. Ethan told himself he would not get attached, that the Mustang was only passing through, but his feet carried him back each morning before coffee, before firewood, before anything else. And each time, the horse's dark eyes met his as if asking the same question he couldn't answer. One afternoon, the crunch of tires on frozen gravel broke the rhythm. Ethan stepped out of the barn, squinting against the low winter sun to see Sheriff Tom's truck pulling into the yard. Dusty blue, old but reliable, it moved with the authority of a man who had been keeping this county together for decades. Tom climbed out slowly, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his gaze sweeping over barn, house, and snow-packed fields. "Afternoon, Ethan," Tom said, voice carrying the weight of habit. He hooked his thumbs in his belt, boots crunching as he walked closer. "Heard you've got company in there." Ethan stiffened. "Word travels fast. In towns like ours, faster than a radio signal." Tom's eyes narrowed. "You know the law. Wild Mustangs fall under federal protection. You can't just take one in." Before Ethan could reply, the barn door creaked. Lila stepped out, sketchbook in her hands, cheeks flushed from the warmth inside. She froze when she saw the sheriff, clutching her drawings tighter to her chest. Tom tipped his hat, a gesture polite but firm. "Afternoon, Miss Lila." Her eyes darted to her father, then back to the sheriff. She said nothing. Ethan's jaw flexed. "He came in on his own during the storm. I didn't chase him, didn't rope him, just gave him shelter. You'd have done the same." Tom looked past Ethan, into the barn where the Mustang shifted in the shadows. "Maybe, but the law won't see it that way. You keep him here long enough, you'll have folks from the bureau knocking on your door. Papers, fines, maybe worse. The barn seemed to grow colder at his words. Ethan glanced at the horse, standing proud despite the walls around him, and felt the old resistance rise in his chest. He was tired of people telling him what he could and couldn't hold on to. Storm would have died out there, Ethan said, surprising himself with the name that slipped free. Tom raised a brow. Storm, is it? Sounds like you're already keeping him. Lila's grip on her sketchbook tightened. She stepped forward, her voice small but steady. He belongs here. The sheriff sighed, the weight of years pressing into his shoulders. I don't doubt your heart, girl, but hearts don't always win. Laws were written for reasons. The sound of boots on snow cut through the tension. A tall woman with auburn hair under a wool cap strode into the yard, carrying a worn satchel slung over her shoulder. Mara Thompson, the traveling vet, had been visiting nearby ranches, and word had reached her too. I hear you've got a patient, she said, glancing between Ethan and Tom. Without waiting for permission, she brushed past them into the barn. Her eyes swept over the Mustang, reading scars, posture, tension, like lines in a book. He's not just passing through, Mara said softly, kneeling near the stall. He's carrying old injuries, more than what you can see. He needs rest, care, and someone willing to be patient. She looked back at Ethan, her voice gentle but firm. That someone might be you. Tom exhaled, exasperated, but said nothing. His duty was clear, but so was the conflict in his eyes. He too had lost enough to know the cost of closing a door. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, caught between law and heart. He wanted to push everyone away, to close the barn and pretend the world didn't exist. But then he caught his daughter's gaze. Steady, pleading, brighter than he had seen in years. His throat tightened. He stays for now, Ethan said, voice low. Through the storm, at least. The sheriff studied him, then the girl, then the horse. Finally, he tipped his hat again. Don't make me regret giving you time, Ethan. As the truck drove away, its tires crunching into the distance, Ethan returned to the barn. Storm shifted, ears flicking, muscles taut. Mara stayed behind, resting her hand on the rail. Trust takes time, she murmured. For him. For you. Ethan didn't answer, but his hand brushed the wooden beam as if searching for balance. Lila leaned against the stall, sketchbook pressed to her chest, her eyes, never leaving the Mustang. The air inside felt charged, full of tension, but also possibility. Between the weight of law and the pull of the heart, a fragile path stretched out. And Ethan knew he had stepped onto it, whether he was ready or not. The sheriff's truck was no more than a distant hum when Ethan returned to the barn. The air inside was heavy, layered with the smell of hay, horse sweat, and something unspoken that had lodged itself between him and his daughter. Mara had lingered a moment longer, her hand resting on the stall rail, her words still circling in his mind. Trust takes time. For him, for you. That evening, Ethan lit the forge. He hadn't used it much since the harvest ended, but the cold snap gave him reason enough. Sparks flew as he pumped the bellows, orange fire blooming against the iron. Each strike of the hammer rang through the barnyard, sharp and final, a heartbeat forged in steel. Storm, tied in the outer pen, snorted and stamped, muscles quivering at the unfamiliar noise. At first, The horse pulled back, eyes rolling white, hooves scattering snow. Ethan kept his strokes steady, refusing to look up. He knew the sound was violent, but he also knew rhythm could soothe once fear passed. Slowly, after what felt like hours, the horse's ears flicked forward. The wild tremor softened into watchfulness, its body still taut, but no longer ready to bolt. Lila emerged from the house, drawn by the light and sound. She watched her father from the shadows, sparks casting him in a fiery glow, as if the forge itself was burning away something more than iron. She clutched her sketchbook close, eyes darting between him and the horse. Storm's head lowered slightly, tail swishing, until the animal stood still, listening. Ethan quenched the iron in a bucket, steam hissing, and looked up for the first time. Storm had not run. Instead, it stared at him with a strange intensity, as though testing his endurance as much as his strength. For a moment, Ethan almost smiled. "Not so bad, is it?" he murmured, his voice softer than he intended. The horse's ears twitched in answer, and Ethan felt something stir in his chest, a fragile echo of connection he hadn't let himself feel in years. Later that night, as he raked out the embers, Lila slipped into the pen, moving slow, careful. She held a piece of apple in her palm, arms stretched steady. Storm eyed her warily, nostrils flaring. Ethan froze, torn between warning her back and letting her try. The barn was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Storm stepped forward, muzzle brushing her hand before snatching the apple. Lila's breath caught in a laugh that trembled with relief. She glanced up at her father, her eyes shining with something more than victory. It was hope, pure and unguarded. Ethan swallowed hard. The forge behind him popped as a coal cracked, the sound echoing like punctuation to a sentence he hadn't spoken aloud. They were all finding rhythm again. Slowly, one cautious note at a time. Storm shook its mane, scattering straw, and for the first time since entering Ethan's life, didn't turn away. The walls of the barn seemed wider, warmer, as though holding not just an animal, but a fragile beginning. The walls of the barn seemed wider, warmer, as though holding not just an animal, but a fragile beginning. Lila slept with her sketchbook on her chest and woke before dawn, the memory of Storm's breath still warm against her palm. By the time the first thin seam of light cut the eastern ridge, she was already at the kitchen table, tearing brown paper from old grocery sacks, stitching them with twine into a makeshift book. She lettered a title in pencil on the cover, Storm's Journal, then paused, as if naming the horse on paper might make him less likely to vanish back into the hills. Ethan came in from the porch with the kind of quiet that suggested he'd been up much longer. He set a coffee mug by her elbow and tried not to look like he wanted to ask about the apple, about the moment he'd almost interrupted. The kitchen carried the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the wall clock. Beyond the frosted window, the day raised its pale, indifferent face. Bills were stacked under a magnet shaped like a trout, feed, tools, a late notice from the bank reminding him of the mortgage payment due before spring prices rose. He slid the stack farther under the magnet, as if obscurity were a kind of grace. Insurance on the tractor would renew next month. He scribbled a note and shoved it in his pocket. Ordinary words, home insurance, farm equipment coverage, looked out of place next to a child's looping title on a handmade book. "Coffee's hot," he said. "Thanks," she murmured. "I'm going to the barn." He wanted to tell her to wait for him. Instead, he drained his mug and followed a minute later, giving her enough lead to feel like the choice was hers. Snow still bordered the yard in cold ridges, but the path to the barn was worn tight by boot and hoof. When he pushed the door open, he found Lila sitting cross-legged by the stall, her back straight, the journal open on her lap. Storm stood several feet away, head angled so one dark eye caught all her movements. "Day 1, Lila said softly, pencil hovering. Storm accepted an apple yesterday. He listened to the rhythm of the forge. He watched Dad. He did not run." She glanced up. "That's true, right?" Ethan leaned his arms on the stall rail and nodded. "True enough." She wrote the sentence slowly, as if the graphite could carry hope without breaking. The horse swished its tail, ears flicking toward Ethan, then back to her. Mara's voice drifted into the moment as the vet came through the door, knocking snow from her boots with the blunt edge of her cuff. She had that easy way of appearing at the necessary time without being invited, as if the wind itself had decided. "Good morning," Mara said, checking the horse with a glance that took in breath, stance, and the dry sheen in the eyes. "He looks steadier." "Journal says so," Ethan said, before he could stop himself. Mara smiled. "Then the journal is already doing its job." They worked without fanfare that morning, Ethan mucking the stall, Lila sketching the curve of Storm's neck, Mara laying out a salt lick and checking the hooves from afar. She didn't push. She spoke to the horse in a low voice, her hands empty, palms forward, a posture that made the barn's dim light feel brighter. Storm watched, the fine muscles at the base of his neck shifting with each breath. When the wind pressed hard at the walls, he flinched. When the rafters creaked, he stepped sideways, but he did not crash. He did not strike. Patience pooled in the air like sunlight caught in dust. At noon, June arrived with 2 thermoses and a paper sack of empanadas her mother had made. She ducked her head, shy and bright in the same breath. "I brought fuel," she said, "for artists and people who smell like hay." "You're both," Lila told her, grinning. She passed June the journal. "We're keeping track, not just drawings. Everything." June flipped through the early pages. Sketches of hooves planted like punctuation marks in straw, the silhouette of Storm's head, a careful study of an eye with the white showing only at the corners. Between them, Lila had written short lines like, "Weather reports. Less stamping today. Turned ear toward me when I said his name." June added her neat handwriting beside a sketch. "He likes it when you breathe out slow. He breathes with you." She drew an arrow toward the horse as if to underline the truth. Ethan watched the girls trade pencil and thermos and secrets, their friendship swinging like a gate on a well-oiled hinge. He felt the tug of something that was not quite envy and not quite relief. They were building a bridge he could not name. Girl to horse, girl to girl, daughter to father. Bridges made of paper and apple slices, and the kind of patience he had long ago traded for the harsh currency of survival. He turned to fix a loose board, pretending it demanded his full attention. The afternoon slid by. The Mustang dozed standing up, lower lip loose, ears relaxed. When the wind rattled the door, he woke quickly, and his muscles tightened, but he returned to calm sooner each time. Mara, packing her satchel, left them with a look of satisfaction. "Keep the routine gentle," she said. "Rituals make room for trust." After she left, Lila moved from sketching to presence. She put the book down and sat facing the stall, hands open on her knees, breathing slow. June mirrored her. The barn sighed and creaked and settled around them. Ethan filleted silence with the small, harmless noises of work, sweeping, hanging a halter he didn't plan to use, checking the latch that had slammed in last week's wind and sent fear running down all their spines, and he had already oiled it. Now he eased it shut and open again, training the metal to move without noise, as if he could rewrite the past with a hinge and a rag. Lila rose at last and edged closer to the rail. Storm lifted his head, not alarmed, alert. She stopped, counted 3 breaths, took another step. The wound on his shoulder, that pale seam like a river seen from far overhead, caught a slant of winter light. She had sketched it from memory. Now she saw its shape exactly, the way scar tissue rose gently over healthy muscle. She swallowed and spoke without thinking, her voice barely above the haze whisper. I know what it is to have something that doesn't heal right. Ethan's hands stilled. He could not see her face from where he stood, but he felt the tremor in those words as surely as if they were hammered into iron. June looked down. Storm shifted his weight, then stood straighter, as though the sentence had given him a command he could obey. Lila did not reach. She let the air between them fill with steady breath. She thought of the ambulance that never came fast enough, of the casserole dishes on the counter afterward, of the way adults used quiet voices around a girl who had the wrong kind of silence inside. She thought of her father at the forge last night, his silhouette trapped in flame, and how the horse had listened. Day 2, she said gently, even though the journal lay unopened on the floor. You are still here? The Mustang stepped forward, once, then again. He lowered his head, ears soft, and exhaled a slow, warm sigh that fogged the space between them. Lila lifted her hand, palm up. She did not offer food. She offered nothing at all except skin and stillness. Storm's muzzle hovered over her fingers. He breathed her in. The salt, the pencil graphite, the vague sweetness of empanada. He did not take anything because there was nothing to take. He touched her palm with the velvet of his lip and left it there, weightless as a first note in a silent church. Ethan felt his chest knot and then loosen as if a strap had been cut. He did not trust what rose in his throat, so he swallowed hard and stared at the stall post until the grain blurred. He heard, not with his ears, but in that secret place where a man's compass used to live, the sound of something turning toward home. When Storm lifted his head again, the moment did not break. It bent gently into a new shape. The horse angled his body so the scar on his shoulder faced the girl. Lila understood without instruction. Slowly, so slowly Ethan could count a full 30 breaths. She raised her hand and let her fingertips hover over that pale seam. She waited for the flinch, the snap, the warning stamp. None came. She set her hand down like a leaf settling on water. Heat met heat. Storm sighed. Lila's lashes trembled. June covered her mouth with her fingers and looked at Ethan, not for permission, but to mark him witness. He lifted a hand, a benediction without words. The barn's light thinned to evening. Lila finally withdrew, leaving the air shivering in the shape of her touch. She picked up the journal and wrote, her handwriting uneven with the tremor of the moment. He let me touch the scar. He is not a storm. He is the calm after one. June added, smaller. Breath matches breath. They closed the book and tucked it on a shelf near the salt and the brush they hadn't dared to use. Ethan fixed the latch once more, smoothing the metal with a rag until it whispered shut. Practical thoughts nudged at the edges of wonder. Feed costs, a call he ought to make to the bank about refinancing options before rates shifted, the way mortgage refinance could buy a season when a man needed time. But they faded as quickly as they formed. The night had made a promise the day would have to keep. As they stepped out of the barn, Lila looked back. Storm stood near the rail, head low, watching them. Ethan reached for the light, then paused, leaving it on. The long rectangle of warmth fell across the yard, a path from their door to his. "Day 2, Lila whispered to the cold air. "You are still here." "And so are we," Ethan answered, surprising himself with the gentleness of it. The door swung, the hinge moved soundlessly, and the barn breathed out. The barn door closed softly behind them that night, but the light Ethan left burning spilled across the snow, like a ribbon of fire guiding them back home. It glowed in Lila's eyes long after she slipped under her quilt, and when she dreamed, it was not of loss but of warmth, her hand resting on a scar, the steady rise and fall of a wild chest beneath her touch. Morning came crisp and blue. The storm had broken. The sky stretched clear, a sheet of glass too fragile to last. Ethan shoveled the path to the paddock, his breath rising in thick clouds. Storm stood in the corral, mane tangled but eyes watchful, nostrils pulling in the cold like a draft of something sharper than air. For the first time, Ethan considered the space too small for the horse's spirit. He had given shelter. Now he had to give room. Lila arrived with June at her side, the journal tucked safely in June's backpack. Both girls chattered in the way only teenagers could, balancing between secrecy and laughter. Ethan felt the sound wash over him like a tide he had forgotten. He tightened the rope on the corral gate, then handed it to his daughter without speaking. She blinked, surprised. "Are you sure?" she asked. Ethan nodded once. "Let's see what he does with space." Storm tossed his head, ears flicking as the gate swung open. He stood frozen a beat, then surged forward, snow scattering under his hooves. The girls gasped as the Mustang stretched into a gallop, the sheer force of it shaking the frozen ground. His mane streamed black against the white field, his body cutting arcs through the crisp air. Ethan's chest swelled despite himself. This was not the frantic flight of a trapped creature. This was joy, raw and uncontained. Storm bucked once, then landed with a thud, skidding before circling back. His breath rose in twin plumes, his tail high. Lila laughed, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in so long it startled him. Pure, unguarded, it leapt into the cold and refused to die. June doubled over beside her, clutching the fence rail, her laughter ringing like bells. For a moment, the sound matched Storm's rhythm, weaving into his gallop as though the earth itself had written the harmony. Ethan leaned against the post, hammer still hanging at his belt, and allowed himself a small smile. Not the forced kind he used at town meetings or when neighbors asked about crops. This one came unbidden, almost forgotten. He caught himself, wiped it away quickly, but not before Lila noticed. "He likes it," she called across the paddock, her cheeks pink from the wind. "He likes us." Storm slowed, circling, then approached the fence with deliberate steps. His ears angled forward, curious rather than cautious. Lila reached out, fingertips brushing the cold metal of the rail, her eyes pleading silently with her father. Ethan gave a slow nod. Steady, he warned. Lila stretched her hand over the top. Storm's muzzle pressed against her palm. No apple this time. No offering, but warmth. The horse blew softly, the sound almost playful. Lila laughed again, softer, and this time Ethan didn't turn away. June pulled out the journal, scribbling quickly. First gallop, first laugh. Storm played with the wind. She added a small sketch. 3 curved lines like motion across the page. Later, when the light dipped and shadows stretched long, Ethan closed the gate. Storm didn't fight him. The Mustang walked in on his own, sweat steaming from his coat, body glowing in the last gold of the sun. He stopped near Ethan, close enough that the man felt the warmth radiating from his skin. For a breathless second, it seemed the horse was waiting for something more than hay or water. Ethan reached out, hesitant, then let his fingers brush the air just short of contact. "Not yet," he whispered. "But soon." Storm's ears flicked, and he snorted, stamping once, as though the promise had been understood. That night, as they sat by the kitchen stove with mugs of cocoa, Lila leaned her head against her sketchbook. "He's different when he runs," she said, "like he's telling us not to give up." Ethan stirred the fire, listening. He didn't answer, but his silence was no longer the wall it once had been. It was something else. A space. A pause. An opening. And in that opening, the laughter from earlier still lingered, echoing faintly, carrying them into whatever came next. The laughter of the day before lingered like warmth in the walls, but by morning, Ethan felt the weight of eyes that weren't yet there. Word traveled too easily in small towns, and by the time he walked into Miller's feed supply for oats and salt blocks, he caught the curious glances. A rancher at the counter lowered his voice, whispering to another about Cole's wild one. Ethan kept his head down, paid his bill, and carried the sacks out without a word. The Mustang was no longer just theirs. That Saturday, the high school equestrian team gathered at the practice arena on the edge of town. Lila had begged to bring Storm, her voice trembling with the urgency of a plea she didn't often make. Ethan resisted at first, but Mara had leaned on him with a quiet firmness. "He needs to learn the world isn't just your barn," she'd said. "And so do you." So here they were. The arena smelled of sawdust and leather polish, the bleachers dotted with neighbors who had come more for gossip than for horses. Frost still clung to the rails, and the low winter sun threw long shadows across the dirt. Ethan unloaded Storm carefully, rope loose in his hand, every muscle coiled. The Mustang stepped down, ears flicking at the chatter, eyes darting to the banners flapping in the wind. Lila walked at his side, chin lifted higher than her years. Her boots crunched steady on the gravel, her other hand clutching the journal June carried like a sacred text. They entered the ring, and for a moment the town hushed. Storm's coat, dark against the pale light, gleamed with a strength that no domestic horse could mimic. Even the children in the stands leaned forward, sensing the difference. Ethan felt it too, the way the animal's presence filled the space, demanding respect. He wanted to shield Lila from every stare, every whisper, but she moved with a calmness that surprised him. She unclipped the lead and let Storm circle her, her body turning slowly, her eyes fixed on his every movement. The horse snorted, pawed once at the dirt, then fell into rhythm, tracing a wide circle around her. The crowd murmured. Someone clapped quietly, another lifted a phone to record. Ethan's throat tightened. He hated the exposure, hated the way the story might spread beyond their control. Yet in that ring, the bond between his daughter and the horse outshone the whispers. June scribbled in the journal, her handwriting fast. First circle without rope. Crowd saw. Storm listened only to her. She passed it to Ethan, and for once he didn't push it away. His eyes lingered on the words, the truth undeniable. Storm slowed, lowered his head, and came to stand beside Lila, his shoulder brushing her sleeve. She reached up and laid her palm on his neck. No apple. No coaxing. Just trust. The bleachers erupted in applause, the sound startling the Mustang for a split second, but he didn't bolt. Instead, he pressed closer to Lila, seeking her steadiness against the noise. Mara leaned against the rail, satisfaction in her eyes. Sheriff Tom stood farther back, arms crossed, watching with a face that gave nothing away. Ethan met his gaze across the arena and knew the silence was temporary. The law still waited, and now the town had witnessed what might be called possession. But when he looked back at his daughter, cheeks flushed, eyes alive, standing proud beside the wild horse, Ethan felt something stronger than fear. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving her grief. She was shining through it. After the arena emptied and neighbors drifted home with stories to tell, Ethan loaded Storm into the trailer. As the ramp clanged shut, Lila turned to him, her voice low but steady. "He belongs with us, Dad. Everyone saw it." Ethan gripped the rope, fingers whitening. He wanted to argue, to warn her of how quickly things could be taken away, but the words tangled in his throat. He only nodded, and as the truck pulled onto the road, he felt the weight of the town's eyes following them home. That night, when he checked the stall before bed, Storm stood quietly, chewing hay. Lila's journal lay open on the shelf where she had left it. Ethan picked it up, tracing her last entry with his calloused thumb. Everyone saw. He closed the book gently, set it back down, and whispered into the stillness, "That's what I'm afraid of." The applause from the arena still echoed in Ethan's ears long after the truck rattled back down the county road. The sight of his daughter standing proud beside the Mustang should have been enough to steady him, but instead it made the knot in his chest tighten. He had seen the phones raised, the glances traded. In towns like Livingston, gossip galloped faster than any horse. By nightfall, Storm was no longer their quiet secret. He was a story being told over coffee cups and kitchen tables. That evening, the barn was quiet, warmer than the air outside. Lila lingered with her journal, scribbling notes and sketches under the lantern's glow. Storm nosed the straw, ears pricking whenever her pencil scratched too quickly. Ethan patched a broken hinge on the feed bin, each clang of his hammer echoing too loud in the hush. The calm almost convinced him they might have bought time. But winter had its own plans. The wind rose as night deepened, gusts rattling the rafters and whistling through every gap in the boards. Ethan tightened the stall latch again and again, muttering curses at metal that refused to stay still. He remembered too vividly the way a single slammed door had sent Storm into panic before. He told himself he'd fixed it, that oil and patience had smoothed the hinge enough. Near midnight, a violent gust tore down the valley. The barn door slammed shut with a crack like a rifle shot. The sound ripped the night apart. Storm reared back, striking against the stall wall, his hooves exploding against the wood. Lila screamed as she stumbled in the straw, her sketchbook flying. Ethan lunged forward, hands reaching for his daughter. "Lila!" he shouted, hauling her out of the stall as the Mustang thrashed. The horse's eyes went white, body a storm unto itself, slamming against the rails as if the barn had turned into a trap. For a terrifying second, Ethan saw it all collapse. The walls, the fragile trust, the thin thread binding them together. Lila clutched his arm, tears streaking her face, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the horse, her voice shaking. "It's not his fault, Dad. He's scared." Storm crashed once more against the boards, then stopped, chest heaving, legs trembling. He stood with his head low, nostrils flaring, foam flecking his lips. The stall was scarred, but still holding. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Ethan's breath came ragged. His arm ached where he'd pulled Lila free, but relief washed him colder than fear. He turned to his daughter, ready to scold, to banish her from the barn for her own safety. But the words died when he saw her face. Eyes wide, cheeks wet, not with terror, but with something deeper. "He'll never trust us if we treat him like he's broken," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. Ethan felt the words slice through him. Because he knew she wasn't only speaking about the horse, she was speaking about herself, about him, about the silence that had hung between them since the night they lost her mother. He steadied her shoulders, but his own voice was unsteady. "I can't lose you too." The barn seemed to hold its breath. Storm shifted, his ears flicking toward them, as though listening. The wind pressed at the walls again, but quieter now, almost gentle. Lila pulled away and bent to gather her fallen sketchbook, its pages bent and smudged. She cradled it against her chest as though it were more than paper. Ethan wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed caught in his throat. He turned instead to the stall, forcing his own fear into action. He spoke low, the way he once had to a skittish colt years ago. "Easy, boy. It's over. You're safe." His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time he realized he wasn't only speaking to the horse. Storm blew out a long, shaky breath, then lowered his head almost to the straw. Not surrender, but exhaustion. Ethan pressed a hand to the rail, feeling the tremor run through the wood. His knuckles were white, his chest tight, but he didn't look away. When the lantern burned low, father and daughter stood side by side in silence, the Mustang's ragged breathing filling the space between them. The storm outside drifted east, leaving only snow hissing against the walls. But inside, something fragile had cracked open, and there would be no going back. The barn carried the echo of that slam long after the wind had gone. Boards still trembled faintly, straw smelled of sweat and fear, and every sound seemed too loud against the silence that followed. Ethan had barely slept, sitting in the chair by the stove, boots still on, watching the fire sink into embers. Lila had gone to bed, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, as though it could keep her steady. By morning, light cut through the frosted glass of the kitchen. Ethan poured coffee into his cup, the scrape of ceramic harsh in the stillness. Lila shuffled in, her eyes rimmed red from the night before. She said nothing, setting her sketchbook on the table. The cover was bent, corners smudged, but she opened it anyway. Her hands shook only once before she steadied them. She drew in silence, pencil whispering across paper, lines forming the shape of storm mid-rear, mane wild, eyes wide with terror. Then she drew a second image beneath it. Storm's head lowered, breath fogging, exhaustion pulling him down. Ethan watched, his throat aching. He had never told her what it was like the night her mother didn't come home, the way fear had slammed into him like a door, leaving him thrashing against walls no one else could see. "Lila," he began, then stopped. Words had always betrayed him, left him raw. He rubbed his forehead and tried again. "You were right. About last night. It wasn't his fault." Her pencil paused. She didn't look up. "I know." He wanted to say more, to explain how fear carves scars deeper than wounds, how sometimes a man can't stop waiting for the next slam. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The kitchen clock ticked, each second pressing. Later, when they walked to the barn together, the snow squeaked underfoot. The world was bright, deceptively calm, as though nothing had happened. Storm stood in the stall, head low, ears half back. The scar on his shoulder caught the light, pale against the dark. Ethan stepped closer, but the Mustang shifted, hooves pawing once. "Easy," Ethan murmured. His voice shook, though not from fear. "It's all right." Lila stood beside him, sketchbook hugged tight. She whispered so softly he almost missed it. "Sometimes it feels like he knows everything we don't say." The words struck deep. Ethan turned toward her, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. He reached out, hand hovering above her shoulder, but dropped it before touching. Instead, he moved to the rail, resting his palm against the wood. Mara arrived mid-morning, her boots crunching on the snow. She studied the horse, then the people. "He's not broken," she said, echoing Lila's words from the night before. "But he'll need time. So will you." Her gaze lingered on Ethan, making it clear she wasn't speaking only about the Mustang. Sheriff Tom stopped by later, the crunch of his tires sharp in the brittle air. He leaned against his truck, arms crossed. "Heard about last night," he said. "Storm spooked half the valley from the sound of it." Ethan stiffened. "He's fine." "Fine doesn't keep you legal," Tom replied. His voice softened, just enough to show the man under the badge. "You keep him. You'd better be ready to fight for him, and not just with your hammer and nails." The warning landed heavy. Ethan looked past Tom, at the horizon smeared pale blue, and felt the truth press down. That evening, Lila returned to the barn alone. She stood before Storm's stall, her hand trembling as she opened the journal. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she read aloud her newest entry. "He isn't broken. He's just waiting for someone not to leave." Storm lifted his head, ears flicking. His breath fogged the space between them, brushing her cheek like an answer. Ethan, standing in the doorway unseen, felt his chest twist. He wanted to step in, to tell her he hadn't meant to leave her alone in grief, that he had been just as scared as the horse thrashing against the walls. But the words clung like iron in his throat. So he stood in the shadows, letting his daughter's voice carry the truth he could not speak, and hoped the Mustang's breath might heal what his silence had broken. The next week dawned with a sky the color of pewter, clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. Ethan stood on the porch with his coffee, watching the horizon tighten. He knew storms, both the kind that came with weather and the kind that came with men carrying papers. The sheriff's words weighed on him. "You keep him, you'd better be ready to fight for him." By mid-morning, Tom's truck rumbled back up the drive. But this time he wasn't alone. A government-issued SUV followed, its tires grinding on the frozen gravel. Two men in dark coats stepped out, their briefcases looking out of place against the barns and fields. They carried the air of formality, the kind that flattened conversation into rules. Ethan's jaw tightened as he met them halfway down the path. "Morning," one of them said briskly. "We're here regarding the Mustang in your possession." Possession. The word struck like a whip. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the barn, where he knew Lila was with Storm. "He came here during the storm. I didn't go out and rope him." "That may be," the man replied, "but under federal law, wild horses remain protected. They cannot be privately kept without authorization. You'll need to release him or face penalties." He opened his briefcase, sliding out a paper thick with legal language. Sheriff Tom stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Ethan felt his blood rise, but before he could speak, Lila appeared at the barn door. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She had heard enough to know what was happening. "No," she said, her voice steady but trembling underneath. "He belongs with us." The officials exchanged a look, their expressions a mixture of pity and irritation. One bent down slightly, softening his tone. "Miss, I know you've grown attached, but this horse needs to be managed properly. He isn't safe here." Storm chose that moment to step forward into the light, ears pricked, his body strong and calm beside Lila. He did not rear, did not thrash. He simply stood, scar glinting pale in the gray daylight, breathing steady. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He thought of the nights spent patching stalls, the forge's rhythm calming the horse, the laughter of his daughter spilling into cold air. He thought of the scar both horse and family carried, how trust had taken root not in grand gestures, but in quiet persistence. "I won't hand him over," Ethan said finally, his voice low but unyielding. "Not after what we've been through." The officials straightened, their patience thinning. "Then you'll need to petition formally. Without paperwork, you're in violation." Mara arrived then, striding across the snow with her satchel swinging. She positioned herself between Ethan and the men, her tone crisp. "He's under veterinary observation. I'll file for temporary rehabilitation custody. That buys time." The men exchanged another glance, this time less certain. "We'll return for follow-up," one said finally, tucking the papers back into his case. "But understand, the law doesn't bend to sentiment." When they left, the air seemed heavier than before. Ethan turned to Mara, his voice rough. "Rehabilitation custody? That's real?" "Real enough to buy you a few weeks," she answered. "After that, you'll need more than time. You'll need people." That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with bills spread before him, the journal resting among them. Lila sat across, sketching Storm's calm stance from earlier, her hand steady. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It was a bridge under construction, fragile but growing. Ethan looked at her drawing, then at the unpaid notices beside it. For the first time, he didn't push the journal aside. He opened it, read the words written in her looping script. "He stood by me when they came. He didn't run." His throat tightened. He closed the book gently, set his hands flat on the table, and said the words he had been holding for too long. "We'll fight for him, Lila. However we have to." Her eyes widened, then softened, and in that moment, the weight of years shifted just enough for both of them to breathe. The papers from the officials still lay on the kitchen table the next morning, their edges curling where Ethan's fist had pressed too hard. He hadn't touched them since, but their presence filled the room like a heavy smell. Lila moved around them carefully, as though even brushing against the pages might tear the fragile truce they'd managed the night before. By noon, Mara returned, her truck tires cutting deep lines through the snow-packed drive. She carried a stack of folders under her arm, her face drawn but determined. "We can't stall forever," she said, brushing the cold from her coat. "If you want to keep Storm legally, we need signatures, testimonies, proof he belongs here." Ethan frowned. "You think folks around here will stand with us? They've been whispering since the arena." "They whisper about everything," Mara replied evenly. "But sometimes whispers turn into voices. You just have to give them reason." That afternoon, the feed store became their first stop. Juniper and her mother were there, bagging flour and sugar, their laughter spilling like sunlight into the dim aisles. When Lila shyly explained the petition, June didn't hesitate. She pulled a pen from her pocket and scrawled her name across the first line. "Storm saved her," June said, nodding toward her friend. "You think that's not reason enough?" Her mother signed, too, pressing her hand firmly on Lila's shoulder. Word spread quickly. By the end of the day, Ethan and Lila stood in the church vestibule, the petition balanced on the same wooden table where bake sales and raffle tickets had passed for decades. Neighbors filed in, some curious, some cautious. Old Mr. Green, who had run cattle for 50 years, shook his head at first. "Wild ones belong in the hills," he muttered. But when he looked at Lila, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering as she told him Storm had chosen to stay, he sighed and bent over the page, his pen scratching slow. Even Sheriff Tom appeared, his badge catching the late light. He studied the petition a long moment before taking the pen. "I don't bend rules easy," he said, his voice rough. "But I've seen what rules can't fix." He wrote his name in deliberate strokes. Each signature shifted something in Ethan. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a chorus rising, a reminder that even in a place where loss had marked him, people could still stand with him. Lila's smile grew wider with each page, her hands trembling not with fear, but with excitement. For the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't carrying the fight alone. That evening, they carried the thickening petition home. The barn glowed warm in the dusk, lantern light spilling through the slats. Storm lifted his head as they entered, ears pricking. Lila ran her hand along his neck, whispering, "We're fighting for you." The Mustang blew out a breath that warmed the air, his body pressing closer as if he understood. Ethan stood back, the petition in his hands, the weight of it solid and undeniable. He thought of mortgages, of debts, of nights when silence seemed easier than trying. Now, for the first time in years, he felt something else. A fight worth carrying, not out of obligation, but out of love. He met his daughter's eyes, and the words came without hesitation. "We'll take this as far as it goes." The barn was quiet, except for Storm's steady breathing. But in that moment, it felt as if the whole town stood with them. The petition lay heavy with signatures by the end of the week, its pages smudged with ink and fingerprints. Ethan tucked it into an envelope, but he knew papers couldn't shield against storms. And storms were coming. The horizon glowed a bruised gray, the wind sharp as a blade. Snow gathered again along the fence line, rattling, the barn doors like an old memory refusing to stay quiet. Inside, Storm shifted uneasily, his ears twitching at each gust. Lila stood beside him, her hand stroking the dark line of his mane, whispering soft reassurances. Ethan tightened the hinges on the gate, but he could feel it. Nature would test them again. It always did. By nightfall, the gale rose. The valley roared with the sound of winter crashing against every roof and fence. Ethan had seen worse, but this storm carried a weight beyond weather. It was a trial, as though the earth itself wanted to know if their bond was true. The barn shuddered, and then it happened. A plank cracked, the gate flew wide, and snow and wind burst in like a wave. Storm's eyes flashed white. His muscles surged with instinct. Without hesitation, he bolted into the night, his dark form swallowed by the swirl of snow. "Storm!" Lila cried, her voice breaking, her body pressing against the cold, as if she could follow him into the blizzard. Ethan grabbed her shoulders, pulling her back before the wind tore her away. Her fists pounded against his chest, her tears hot against the cold. "You can't let him go." "I can't lose you," Ethan shouted back, his voice hoarse, more plea than command. The storm muffled everything, but the words tore through, raw and bare. They fought the wind to close the gate, the sound of it slamming echoing too much like that night before. But now it wasn't fear inside the barn. It was absence. The empty stall stared at them, straw scattered like abandoned promises. Hours passed, but the storm didn't ease. Lila sat by the door, sketchbook open on her knees, her pencil trembling as she tried to capture the image of Storm leaping into the snow. Ethan tended the fire, his hands shaking as he fed logs, every crack of wood sounding like hooves fading into distance. Neither spoke. Near dawn, the blizzard thinned, leaving the land buried under drifts. The silence was terrible. Too wide. Too final. Lila rose, eyes swollen but fierce. "We have to find him," she said. Ethan wanted to say no, to tell her the land could swallow a horse forever, but he saw the fire in her, the same fire her mother once carried when she refused to give up on him. He nodded. Bundled against the cold, they stepped into the white wasteland. Tracks carved across the snow, deep and frantic at first, then calmer, straighter, leading toward the ridge where the wild herds sometimes roamed. Storm had run, but not in panic. He had chosen a path. By mid-morning, they reached the rise. The wind had scoured the snow clean, revealing the valley spread wide and still. And there, silhouetted against the pale sun, stood Storm. His body steamed in the cold, mane tangled, scar stark against his shoulder. He looked back at them, then forward toward the mountains where freedom waited. Lila's breath hitched. Ethan's heart pounded. This was the test, freedom or family, wild or home. The gate was open, and Storm was on the other side. The horse pawed the ground, head tossing, breath pouring white into the air. Then he stilled, ears turning, eyes fixed on the two figures below. The world held its breath. Ethan reached for his daughter's hand. "Don't call him," he whispered. "It has to be his choice." So they stood, side by side, waiting. The cold bit deep, but neither moved. And in the silence, only the wind spoke, carrying with it the sound of hooves that might return, or vanish forever. The ridge held stillness so sharp it seemed carved from glass. Snow glittered across the valley floor, the sun breaking through tattered clouds in pale shafts of light. Storm stood poised at the crest, his body outlined against the sky. Behind him stretched the endless sweep of mountains, freedom unmeasured. Before him, two figures waited, motionless in the cold, offering nothing but presence. Lila's hand squeezed Ethan's, her knuckles white. She didn't speak. She knew words could only scatter what was already fragile. Ethan's breath steamed out slow, the silence between them heavy with every prayer he'd never spoken. This was not a moment he could hammer into shape, not a fight he could win with law or paper. It was a choice belonging only to the horse. Storm pawed the frozen earth, tossing his head, mane snapping like black fire in the wind. He snorted once, loud and sharp, then swung his gaze back to the mountains. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry slicing through the air. For a moment, Ethan thought the decision was made, that Storm would vanish into the wilderness, leaving them with nothing but memory and ache. Then, something shifted. The Mustang's ears turned forward, his body stilled, and he looked back down the slope. Not at the land, not at the open expanse, but at the girl standing beside her father, her cheeks flushed, her breath hitching in the cold. Lila didn't move. She let the weight of her hope rest in stillness, the same way she'd done in the barn with the scar under her palm. Ethan felt the tremor run through her fingers, but she didn't flinch. Storm lowered his head, took one step down the ridge, then another. Snow crunched under his hooves, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Ethan's throat tightened. He dared not breathe. The horse paused halfway, tossing his head again, torn between the wild and the known. Then, with a final shake, he broke into a trot. Not away, but toward them. The ground shuddered with his weight as he closed the distance, mane streaming, steam pouring from his nostrils. He slowed as he reached them, circling once before stopping close enough that his breath brushed their faces. His scarred shoulder gleamed in the sun, no longer a mark of fear, but of return. Lila let go of Ethan's hand and stepped forward, tears spilling down her cheeks. She pressed her face against Storm's neck, her arms wrapping the warmth of him. The horse exhaled a long, deep sigh, settling into her hold. Ethan's chest ached with something sharp and new. He placed a hand on Storm's withers, the coarse hair prickling against his palm. For the first time since the night of the storm years ago, he didn't feel like he was losing. He felt chosen. Behind them, the valley stretched wide and wild, but the Mustang had turned his back on it. The choice had been made, not forced, not begged, but freely given. The wind eased, carrying only the sound of their breathing. Ethan looked at his daughter, her face buried in Storm's mane, and felt his voice break as he whispered, "He came back." And for the first time in years, the words felt like enough. They led Storm home at a walk, the sun lifting clean over the ridge, as if it had been waiting for this decision too. Snow still glazed the fence rails, but in the south pasture, thin green threads had begun to show, stitching color into the white. Storm blew softly at their shoulders, the rope draped like a question no one needed to answer anymore. Lila's glove stayed on his neck most of the way, not tugging, not urging, just there, like a promise kept. The days lengthened. Snowmelt sang in the ditches, and the barn let go of winter's creaks one beam at a time. Ethan set the old halter on a peg where sunlight could find it and didn't reach for it much. Routine settled in like a hymn. Morning hay, slow circles in the paddock, the journal open on the rail with fresh, unhurried lines. The hinge that once betrayed them now closed with a whisper. He'd planed it thin and oiled it until even the wind seemed to tread more carefully. Paperwork traveled its own slow road. Mara brought forms that smelled faintly of toner and certainty. Sheriff Tom showed up with a thermos, and 2 signatures he'd happened to gather. The petition pages grew soft at the edges from passing hands. At the feed store, Mr. Miller slid a stamped envelope across the counter, along with a bag of oats. On the house. Ethan tucked a receipt into his wallet behind an old photo and thought, not without irony, that some storms could be met with ink after all. He even called the bank about options he'd avoided. Mortgage refinance that might lower the note come summer, home insurance adjustments once the new roof went on. He spoke the words without shame. Some burdens were lighter when admitted out loud. He left the credit slip in his pocket beside a dented credit card he no longer used to outrun truth. On the first warm Saturday, the high school reopened its small arena for families and friends. Not a competition, just an exhibition, a place to let winter go in public. Lila wanted to go. Ethan said yes before she finished asking. He loaded Storm into the trailer without the old tightness in his chest, and when the ramp clanged, the horse only flicked an ear and settled into the hay. Livingston gathered in fleece and denim and optimism. The bleachers filled with neighbors whose names were older than their coats. A banner, strung along the rail, fluttered. Local sponsors in block letters, the kind of small-town commerce that stitched people together more than it sold anything. June met them at the gate with the journal pressed to her chest, cheeks flushed, eyes bright in the pale sun. She handed Lila a ribbon she'd braided from twine and blue thread and said, "For courage, not for show." Mara checked Storm with a hand on his shoulder. "He remembers," she murmured, feeling the quiet readiness in his muscles. Sheriff Tom tipped his hat from the fence and tried to look like he was only there to keep order, not to see a miracle repeat itself under easier skies. They entered the ring with no music and no grand announcements. Lila walked in first, then turned so Storm could see the space, the people, the light. The horse stood and breathed, measuring the afternoon. A child somewhere coughed. A father shushed without thinking. Then Lila began to walk, and Storm followed, not crowded, not captured, shoulder to shoulder like 2 notes finding harmony after a long rest. They traced a wide circle. Dust rose, soft and gold. Lila lifted a hand without looking back, and Storm matched it, stepping in, stepping out, learning her smallest cues, the way a heart learns a new tempo. When she stopped and faced him, he stopped too. She reached up and touched the scar on his shoulder the way one might touch a church door, without superstition, with reverence. The murmur in the stands quieted until the whole town could hear the horse breathe. Ethan, at the rail, let the world blur until only 3 things remained: the girl, the horse, the sun. He had no speech for what had been broken and mended, no name for the weight that had lifted. He only knew that the ache he'd carried like a second spine had changed shape. He could stand up straighter. He could look toward next season and see more than weather. He could imagine a spring that stayed. Lila took 1 slow step backward, and Storm followed. Another step. And then, only then, she jogged. Not fast, not to prove anything. Just enough that the horse slid into a floating trot beside her, head low, ears soft. They moved like a sentence finished at last. At the far rail she turned, and Storm turned with her, breath in time with hers, the rhythm so easy a stranger might have mistaken it for something practiced since birth. But the town knew better. They had watched the long winter. They had heard doors slam and seen hands tremble. They had signed their names next to hers because sometimes the only way to carry a story is together, When it was done, there was no explosion of applause. Not at first. People stood the way they stand at funerals and baptisms, aware of thresholds underfoot. Then someone clapped once, and another answered, and the sound rolled across the small arena like rain finding a roof. Lila's mouth trembled into a smile she didn't try to hide. She rested her forehead against Storm's, then looked over the rail at her father. He didn't nod. He didn't lift a hand. He just let the tears show and didn't apologize for them. They drove home in evening light, past fields still patched with snow and fences that would need mending soon. At the kitchen table, the petition envelope lay open beside an official letter that, at last, said what they needed it to say. Temporary custody extended. Review scheduled after spring. It wasn't forever. It was time. They had learned what to do with time. Lila taped the letter inside the journal's back cover, a talisman made of language and faith. June wrote the final day's entry in small, careful letters. He chose us, and we chose the work that goes with being chosen. Mara added a line beneath. Trust is a daily practice. Sheriff Tom, arriving with 2 slices of pie wrapped in wax paper, set them on the counter without ceremony and said, "If anybody asks, I was never here." Then he stayed for coffee and didn't look at the clock. That night, the 3 of them, man, girl, horse, stood in the barn while the world cooled. Crickets hadn't started yet. Spring in Montana likes to take its time. But there was a softness to the air that promised more than survival. Ethan ran a brush along Storm's neck, long strokes, the kind that teach both bodies what calm feels like. Lila hummed a tune her mother used to sing when dishes clinked and windows steamed. The melody stumbled once and found itself again, like a foal learning where to put its feet. Ethan set the brush down and faced his daughter. "I should have said it sooner," he told her. The words not rough now, only true. "I was afraid, and I let the fear do my talking. I'm sorry." She didn't answer with words. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her ear to the place where his heart argued with the past. He held her like a man holds a rope that's finally gone slack in the right way. No panic, no fight. Just enough grip to honor what it's bearing. Storm shifted closer until his breath warmed their sleeves. He lowered his head in that old, deliberate way and touched Ethan's shoulder where a different kind of scar lived. And there they stood. 3 bodies inside a circle, big enough to share, small enough to keep. Spring came on then, not with trumpets, but with drip and thaw and the miraculous boredom of chores done in daylight. On Sundays, the town would stop by in 2s and 3s to lean on the fence and say nothing important. Children would hold sugar cubes in trembling palms and learn that sometimes the sweetest thing is being brave enough to be still. Ethan planted a line of willow cuttings along the ditch, the kind that drink too much and grow anyway. He set aside a little from the farm account for a fence upgrade and put a reminder in his phone to shop around for better home insurance once the barn roof was finished. He wrote a quiet list that included nails, seed, salt, and, after Lila's grin dared, him. 2 tickets to the summer rodeo. "We'll go to watch," he said, "not to chase anything." One evening, when the first shoots in the pasture were stout enough to trust, Ethan slipped the gate and walked Storm out without a rope. The horse stepped beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and when Ethan stopped, he stopped. The sky turned the color of peaches left too long on a windowsill. Frogs started up in the low places. Lila stood by the fence with the journal open to a blank page, then closed it without writing. Some days, the best entry is the one you carry in your chest. They stayed until the light went thin, and the swallows skimmed low. When they headed in, Storm paused at the threshold, the way he had the night he first entered their lives. He looked back at the field, then forward at the stall with clean straw and a rail that no longer shouted. He stepped inside. The hinge whispered shut. The world, for once, agreed. Ethan turned down the lamp, but didn't snuff it fully, leaving a small coin of light to shepherd the dark. Lila slipped her hand into his. "He's home," she said. He looked at her, at the horse, at the quiet barn that had learned how to hold all three truths at once: loss, work, and grace. "So are we," he answered. And that was how spring returned. Like forgiveness, like a gate left open, and a heart choosing to stay. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the simplest way. Just drop a 0 or 1 in the comments. I'll know you felt it. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will bring even more moments between people and animals that you won't want to miss. Together, let's keep these stories alive.